I'm Mark Winter, and you are listening to Verse by Verse. I'm assuming you've had friends in your lifetime that have given you good advice and friends that have given you bad advice. Given enough time, you probably found that you have a friend or more that give both. Sometimes they give good advice and sometimes they don't. I have a question for you. Why is this? Why do some give good advice and others not? Perhaps a better question would be, why does someone give good advice one time and not so good another? In the Bible, we can read about a man named Job. He and his family lived in the land of Uz. That's an area that's considered to be southern Jordan today. Job was an immensely wealthy man. He was well known as a man of integrity, a man who feared God, meaning he had reverence for God, deep respect for him, and followed his instruction. In fact, in the very first chapter of the book of Job, it states that Job was upright and one who feared God and shunned evil. That's actually the first verse of the first chapter. It would be fair to say that he had an excellent reputation. Now, assuming you're familiar with the story of Job, then you know that God allowed Satan to test him in a dramatic way, with few but important limits. In the course of one day, Job heard that all his livestock were either stolen or killed, and all the servants responsible for keeping them were killed. And if that weren't bad enough, all of his children were killed the same day in a tornado or terrible storm. Frankly, I cannot imagine hearing and having to deal with that magnitude of news in many days or weeks or months or even years, much less one day. As you read through the book of Job, you find that he had 4 friends named Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar, and Elihu. And these friends took what happened to Job to mean or imply that Job must have been sinning, and what he was experiencing was punishment for his sin. Let's consider the comments or advice that Zophar shares with Job in chapter 11. And beginning in verse 11, Zophar says, "For he," that is God, "knows deceitful men. He sees wickedness also. Will he not then consider it?" So Zophar is telling Job, you must be doing something wrong, and that's why you're being punished. He then shares the following in verse 12. "For an empty-headed man will be wise when a wild donkey's colt is born a man." Now, the term empty-headed in Hebrew is nabub, meaning someone who is hollow, devoid of true wisdom, foolish. And yet we know Job's reputation was that he feared God. Zophar was being really tough on Job here. Zophar thought he was giving great advice to Job, and yet he made an assumption that was not accurate. He thought Job was being stubborn or rebellious towards God in some way that he wasn't willing to admit, when in fact he was not. What Job was experiencing was something God allowed, as we know from what was shared in chapter 1. Certainly not a punishment from God. While it's certainly true that a fool is not going to exhibit wisdom any more than a donkey will bear a man, what clever imagery, by the way, it's also true that well-intentioned advice from friends may not be on target either. Sometimes rather than sit with a friend and be there to support them without offering advice that may not be on target, it can be very tempting to share something we deem as helpful that really is not. If you ever find yourself with the opportunity to give advice, consider first if you are truly in a position to give accurate, sound advice. Meaning, do you know what you need to know and understand first? Do you really have the information or facts straight? It strikes me that it can be very easy for anyone to share their thoughts, ideas, or advice without first having the insight or understanding needed to do so wisely. Obviously, to do that would not be helpful or ultimately encouraging for a friend. That is a lesson that we can take away from Job 11 and verse 12. "For an empty-headed man will be wise when a wild donkey's colt is born a man."
Verse by Verse is a Life, Hope, and Truth podcast. Check out the show notes to find more free content, like videos, articles, and booklets in our Learning Center.